Djangular. It came from the last time I did it. I was ranting and kind of word vomited Django and Angular at the same time, hence Djangular. About me, I'm Matt Camilli. I'm a senior software engineer at TrackMaven, which is a startup in DuPont, in DC, sorry. You can follow me at MLCamilli, and my blog's mattcamilli.com, although I wouldn't really go there if you're expecting regular content. I find that every time I actually try to blog, I re-engineer it instead, using a new technology rather than actually writing any content. Just as a note, this talk and Fletcher's data talk from yesterday will both be hosted on GitHub. We'll tweet that out, so look for that. Another thing to note is I like to keep my talks pretty open. So if you have a question or a comment at any point in time, just raise your hand or shout it out, and then I'll answer it to the best of my ability. So before I really dive in the nitty-gritty of this talk, I kind of want to give some backstory about what TrackMaven is and why this came to be. TrackMaven, in short, is a competitive intelligence platform for data-driven marketers. And to kind of explain whatever the heck that means, basically we collect data from over 13 different marketing channels for your company and the companies that you compete with or are influenced by. And we offer a set of features basically that we use that data for. The first being this activity feed, where we kind of take all the content that you've done or your competitors have done and give you that Facebook activity feed where we kind of sort it by engagement or how many people have shared or viewed that piece of content. We then allow you to set up alerts, kind of notifying you, let's say if a competitor is about to go viral, so you know kind of what they might be doing so you can adapt. We give you a brand overhaul or profile, which kind of lets you compare yourself versus your competitors, and we give you several metrics in which to judge yourself by. And lastly, with all that pretty data, we let you just kind of graph it out in our visualizer, which pretty much uses Angular and D3 to take all the data that we've served from the back end and provide to the front end. So let's get down to the nitty-gritty. So the problem that we were faced with at TrackMaven is we wanted a fast and fluid user experience while working with a lot of data and a lot of data that changes constantly. And that was kind of a problem based on the technology we had. All we had was Django templates, and while they're great and provide a lot of flexibility as far as HTML is concerned, the data only flows in one way. And I'm not sure if any of you have used Django and tried to do anything asynchronously. You kind of have to use jQuery, and it gets really janky, and there's no real good structure around it. So you'll be finding custom jQuery snippets, and that's kind of like what we used to do, and we wanted to really get away from that and get a better paradigm for going forward. So the solution we came up with is that we would serve all of our data from the back end in a REST API and have the front end asynchronously interact with it, which would give us a really good separation of the client side and server side architecture, so we keep those decoupled. So first, we'll start, I'm sure you've all seen this before. I know for me a couple times is the basic Django tutorial. So I thought for this talk, a good introduction would be to pretty much implement this Django tutorial, but using the architecture I just described, where we'd have a decoupled front end and back end, basically serve all the data on the back end with the Django Rest Framework, and then on the front end consume and interact with that data using Angular. So Django Rest Framework is a powerful and flexible toolkit that makes it easy to build web APIs. It was started and maintained by Tom Christie. It is 100% production ready, and it's used by very large companies such as Mozilla and even Eventbrite. As a quick shout out to them, because we owe them a bunch since half of our app is built on it, they're currently having a Kickstarter to kind of continue the next major release of it. It's already hit 5 times their original goal, and they've got 20 days to go. So definitely look into it because it's an awesome open source project. There are a couple Django REST frameworks out there, but why we chose this one is because it has a few notable features that put it way above the rest. The first being a web browsable API, which I'll show you. It's a really neat feature for kind of interacting with the API you've built. Authentication includes OAuth 1 and OAuth 2, which is really helpful, especially if you're dealing with social services or social networks and you need to kind of auth your users against it. It supports serialization, which we'll get into in a bit, Makes really easy to take your Django models and just convert them to JSON. And it's super customizable. We've had plenty of data types that don't really fit into Django's world. They don't really fit into the Django Rest Framework world, but it supports enough customization that you could just implement your own and add your own modules to the Django Rest Framework. And it has extensive documentation. This is like the one rare time you'll actually hear me say I actually like a third party's documentation. Usually you're kind of left out there struggling with a lot of them. Django Rest Framework does a really good job at getting examples, so that was like the best and easiest way to learn it. So starting off, we're going to go into the basic Django models. This is the one that's built right into the Django tutorial. What we have is just a simple question model for a basic polling app, which is what we're going to be implementing. It basically has a text field holding the question text, a publication date, and then choices that are just foreign keyed to that choice, basically showing how many votes they have in that choice text. So here would be the Django Rest Framework serializers. Right here. They look very similar to Django forms and kind of act like it, but basically serve to serialize and deserialize models into JSON objects, making them really easy to read and consume, going both ways, whether you're pushing to the back end or you're pushing to the front end. Since these models are really basic, we didn't really need to do any custom models, so we were able to use Django Rest Framework's model serializer, which we just simply point it to, for example, the choice serializer just points to the choice and then just includes the fields that we want, so which is basically the choice text, the number of votes, and we want that ID so that we can update the choice once we've voted on it. Then we have the views. Django Rest Framework comes with a bunch of built-in class-based views, making it really easy to make certain API endpoints to update or edit your content. The first one we're talking about is that list create API view. Basically for questions, we want pretty much 2 interactions with questions. We want to be able to see the entire list of every question that we have, and we want to be able to post to an endpoint to also create a new question. So simply all we have to do is provide it with the question model, the serializer that we just made, and just because this app is just for test, we're just going to allow anyone to do it. Obviously, do not do that on production. The question detail is going to be using the retrieve API view. This pretty much is going to give us all the details of that specific question. Basically, what it's going to depend upon is that lookup URL kwarg. So basically, when they go to a certain URL, it's going to look for that parameter and then pass it to this object, which will go take that question and return just the detail of it. Next, we have our choice update view. Basically, when we vote in our poll, we want to be able to have an endpoint where we can just do a put to update the current votes that that choice has. Basically works kind of like the retrieve. It just depends upon a PK that will pass it, and then it'll update the amount of votes. And lastly, we just have a choice list that will just get all of the choices that we have. This is the basic Django URL structure where you can see that we create several endpoints, kind of just calling those class-based views as views, and you can kind of see where those kwargs are passed in, such as in the choices and questions, where you have, we're just expecting a PK, which is going to be a number, to grab those choices. This is that interactive web browsable API, which is probably the most notable feature of Django Rest Framework, and for anyone who's worked on an API before, this is a lovely thing to have. You don't have to keep turning off your server and hitting an endpoint and checking everything. With this Twitter bootstrapped interactive feature, you can kind of do posts, pulls, or gets, and all kinds of requests where you can just specify the parameters and see what that endpoint will return. This is really great when you're iteratively trying to create an API. So this is probably the most debated part of my talk every single time, because there apparently is a holy war between people who like CoffeeScript and people who don't. I want to just come out and say I'm a Python developer, so I like CoffeeScript because CoffeeScript is Pythonic and JavaScript just is a horrible syntax language, and I cannot stand programming in it. When I left the bracket world that was Java and .NET, I left it for good, and that applies to JavaScript as well. So just a little intro into CoffeeScript. It compiles into JavaScript, and the greatest thing is if you've got that one engineer in your team who's really insistent upon using JavaScript, he can just write his JavaScript in the Coffee Age. It's really easy to maintain a project if you've got readable and short code. And lastly, it has built-in list comprehension and pattern matching, which if you're coming from the Python world, being able to just do quick snippets to iterate through loops is just great compared to the syntax in Java or JavaScript. And just in a quick example, on your left side you have CoffeeScript, and on the right side you have JavaScript. This is what I always show people, and this is on their homepage. This is why I use CoffeeScript, because I don't want to ever see that right side in code or edit that again. Okay, let's go down here. All right. And the reason I'm doing this is because also all of my Angular examples are going to be in CoffeeScript, because I want you actually to be able to read them and understand them. So moving on to Angular. AngularJS is a client-side MVC framework by Google, written in JavaScript, and it's used to write single-page web applications through its dependency injection, two-way data binding, and what is known as the Zen of Angular. It made itself stand out amongst all other client-side MVC frameworks and is the main reason we chose to use it. I kind of quickly want to go over the Zen of Angular because I think it really speaks to us and is why TrackMaven we chose to use it. It kind of like reminded me a little bit of the Zen of Python. Firstly, it is a very good idea to decouple DOM manipulation from app logic. This dramatically improves testability of the code. So what you have in Angular is you have separated code for manipulating the DOM, separated code for your business logic, all decoupled into modules that make it very easy to test. It is a really, really good idea to regard app testing as equal in importance to app writing. Testing difficulty is dramatically affected by the way code is constructed or structured. And coming from the consulting world where I quote unquote wasn't paid to test, testing saves so much time and in the long run, hell even in the short run. So having a framework that is based around easy testing is just godsend. It's an excellent idea to decouple the client side of an app from the server side. This allows development to work in progress in parallel. This is something we've really, really came to appreciate with our app. We can make huge changes to the front end without having to even affect the back end, and we can push them and handle them separately, which as your apps become more complex, there's a lot of times where you just want to deal with the code on the front end, and when it comes to deploy, you don't have to redeploy the back end if it hasn't been affected in any way, shape, or form. This is a really nice perk of separating those two. And it is very helpful indeed if the framework guides developers through the entire journey of building an app, from designing the UI through writing the business logic to testing. This is something that Django has done very well, and this is why I think Angular pairs perfectly with it. I've used lots of frameworks where you're kind of like, well, you can do all of these things, go. Angular has a really good documentation, and like Django has a very good tutorial walking you through all the different steps and what they have accepted as best practices. So I think for the rest of this, I just want to kind of jump into the code and walk you along. So if you have any questions along the way, again, feel free to ask. So the first steps. The first steps in any Angular app is to define the app, define the module itself, which looks like this. Basically here we're calling an Angular module, which we'll call the poll app. And then to the right, that list is the list of dependencies that this app is reliant on. We'll kind of get more into those dependencies later on. And that snippet of code below where you see interpolate providers, this is a quick snippet to make Angular play really nicely with Django templates. We had the problem of there was a lot of template tags that we relied on in our app, so we kind of wanted to still use Django templates while using Angular in them. Problem is Angular uses double brackets as does the Django templating engine, so they would conflict. This is a quick little snippet to just use square brackets for Angular so that they don't interfere with one another. And then there's, oh, yep.
Would it matter though, because they're using an API, like when your backend is just spinning out JSON?
Right, but the actual template, so what would happen is your Django, you would have one view that serves the single page web app that Angular is hosted on. And let's say you have certain Django tags that you want to use in there. Like for instance, all your static content might be hosted in that static URL Django tag. You want to be able to still use those Django tags with your front side Angular app. So that's what allows us to do that. This is the last little fix to get Django playing nicely with Angular. Django has built-in CSRF protection. And the reason I'm making this a point, because this took hours of my life, not knowing what was going wrong, why none of my posts were working. I'll host this and show this out later, but pretty much we just go take that token, our CSRF token, and add it to the headers so that Angular will play nicely with Django. So once we've got our app defined, that app module, we kind of just need to put it in the initial template. We have this ng app directive, which will just point to that poll app, which was the what we named that module that we had. And then just put in this brief div that says UI view, which will come into play later. It's pretty much just a placeholder where our templates will go later on. Oh, and I mentioned that ng app is a directive. Directives in our markers on the DOM. It could be an attribute name, an element name, a comment, or a CSS or a class that tell AngularJS's HTML compiler that to attach specific behavior to it. There's a lot built into Angular, and there's a lot you can define yourself. At the end of this, we'll define our own directive to manipulate the DOM, to kind of do special HTML things, as you'll see soon. Okay, so we're going to get into services. Basically, services are reusable business logic, independent of views, wired together using dependency injection. So for our purposes, we're going to use services to create a factory that'll interact with our back end, pretty much to fetch all those questions and choices. And then we're also going to use services to generate classes and almost Django models on the front end, if you will, to populate all the data that we just pulled in, so that we have JavaScript objects that we can interact with. So for the first example, this is a factory called questions, and that's kind of how we typically do our naming convention. We'll give the models like question or choice, and then the handlers of those questions, plural. Basically what this does is it depends upon a couple modules. The log module, just to let us know if stuff's working or not. The HTTP module, which allows us to do asynchronous calls to the back end. And the question service, which we'll define later on. This service pretty much has a dictionary with the key all for storing all the questions that we'll collect. It has a basic method called fromServer, which takes the data from the back end and then just instantiates new question objects and adds it to its dictionary. And then it has a fetch method, which basically does a get to the polls questions, which was that API endpoint that we made. And on success, call that fromServer, and if not, log it. Lastly, it has a data method, which is just simply a getter for all the questions we just put into it.
Can you speak to the importance of the $sign?
Yes. So $sign modules are built into Angular. That means it's an Angular one defined. So Angular comes with a myriad of built-in modules that you can use. We'll get into some later where we choose not to use the Angular built-in ones and rather go with Angular UI, which is a framework that's become community accepted as having some better modules for interacting with things. But yeah, every time you pretty much see the $sign, that means it's a built-in Angular module, not user-defined. So here's our question class. Basically, this factory will be what we use to hold all the data for each particular question, just to kind of make it isolated in itself. Simply has a constructor. If we pass it data, initialize it with that data, which And this is CoffeeScript notation here. At means this. So just set this.questionText to the data.questionText. Set total votes to 0, have a place to store choices, and then go through all the choices, creating new choices and adding it to its array, and increasing the amount of total votes based on the amount of votes that each choice has. And then here's the second part of that class, which we have a get to get an individual question. So basically it has an endpoint which we can pull just that one particular question's details. This is going to come in handy when we have an endpoint. Hey, I want to see this poll, get me just this poll's details. And it works similarly to the previous questions class. Lastly, we have our choice class, which just simply stores the choice text, the ID, so we know what to update, and the amount of votes that it has. It has an update method, which just pretty much takes all the data from that object and then does a put to that choices endpoint to update the current choices. This way, when we vote, we can update it on the front end immediately and also asynchronously to the back end. This is all CoffeeScript, yep. So yeah, if there's any notation that you don't understand, just ask and I can explain. Arrow sign is how they define functions in CoffeeScript. So it's the same as saying equals function parentheses. All right, now we're going to get into states, which is kind of similar to the Django URLs. This is the one case where I was talking about where we'll use a community or third-party module rather than the built-in Angular module. We're going to use UI router, which has become the community standard for doing states. Basically, the only time we'll use the built-in Angular URL router is for that first line, which is simply saying, hey, if you send us anything that we don't recognize, a URL that we don't recognize, we're just going to default you to /, which is our home page, the first state that we'll define. Now that first state we're going to call questions list, and this is simply going to be a view where we list all the questions that we just populated from the back end. We pass it a template URL, which we'll get into where we store templates soon. We'll pass it a name of a controller, and then we have what's called a resolve. A resolve is a way to pass data to that state or view before actually going to it. So you might have the same controller or the same view. You might have two different states that have pretty much everything the same except for maybe a different resolve. That way you can pass it variable information. Here we pretty much just fetch all the questions to pass it in before that view happens. The question detail state pretty much is similar to the previous one. It takes an ID, and basically with that ID, we're going to create a new question, which will just kind of pull from that backend API asynchronously, so that when it gets that question detail controller, it'll already have that poll that it's working with particularly. Now these controllers interact with templates defined, controllers, yes. So basically what controllers are is they're the back-end business logic. Pretty much their main job is to interact with scope objects, and scope objects will be the bane of your existence when working with Angular. Pretty much how best to define a scope, it's the glue between the application controller and the view. They are used to expose the domain model to a view. We can add properties to the scope, functions to the scope, and pretty much everything contained in the scope can be used by the template. So this is where we'll set pretty much like in Django when you pass variables to the template, this is the same thing. We set all the variables and properties that we need on the scope object so the template has something to access. So the first controller is just our question list controller, which is dependent upon a scope, a state, log, and questions, which we've passed it with the resolve. And all it does is it takes all of those questions and puts it on the scope so the template has something to pull from. The next controller is a little more complicated. What it does is it takes the original scope and instantiates it with the basic question that we've passed it based on that ID. It defaults voted to false so that we know the user hasn't voted yet. It defaults the vote choice to 0 because they haven't chosen anything yet. And then it defines a function, the vote function. Basically, all that does is it iterates through every single choice that we have, and if that choice ID equals the choice that they've entered, we're going to up its vote by 1, we're going to up the total votes by 1, and we're going to update that choice on the back end, and then mark voted as true. Now, these controllers interact with the templates, which we stated in the states. And templates can be stored in a separate file, but like for single page app, I find it's easy to just include them all in the same HTML page, which gets a little lengthy, but it's just HTML. And you define them with these script types of ng templates, where the ID is the ID that we listed in the state. Now, for the question list template, we pretty much is this simple. We use what's called the ng repeat directive, which pretty much is a way of doing a for loop in the code. Pretty much for every question in questions, we're going to create this new link to point to a certain state. And all that is the UI router's way of saying, hey, call question detail, pass it that question ID, and then show question text as the link text. The question detail template gets a little more complicated. We kind of separate it into 2 parts based on whether you voted or not. So this is a form where it has an ng submit, which is just a directive saying, hey, when this form is submitted, what should I do? We're going to call that scope.vote that we defined earlier in the controller. So pretty much upon submitting, it doesn't go to the back end. It just goes back to that controller and executes the vote method which you defined. The ng show is a quick little directive for hiding objects or showing objects on the screen. Basically, if we haven't voted yet, show this form. And simply, the actual form itself is we just repeat for all the choices in that question, and we give a little radio button so you can choose, and then a submit button. And just to note, every time you do an ng repeat, it creates a scope for just that for loop. This is really kind of tricky at times because its scope kind of like sets the current choice and like where you are in the for loop. So if we wanted to actually access the scope, which this contains all of the question and all the choices in it, we'd have to call a parent, which we call in that ng model right there as parent.voteChoice. And that's that thing that we initialized as 0. The second part of the question detail template is basically what to show if you actually have voted. Basically here we will go through all the choice and the question choices, and we will print this little, we'll print the text and the votes, and we'll print this little Twitter Bootstrap progress bar, which is done in this div class right here. And you can see in that div class, aside from the styling we have some custom attributes defined where you can see choice percentage, votes, and total. Choice percentage is going to let Angular know that it is a directive that we've constructed, which I'll show you in a second. And votes is just simply setting certain attributes on that directive. To show that directive, pretty much it's defined as choice percentage, and thing to note about this, which is really tricky as well, it automatically converts camel case. This took a while to find out. So basically, where you see choice directive or choice percentage right here, in HTML, it's looking for choice dash percentage. This is just a built-in feature to Angular. Again, I don't know why it's not more apparent than it is, but it'll definitely save you a few hours remembering that. Basically what we say here is restrict to type A. What that means is we only want to look for attributes that HTML elements that have that attribute choice percentage on it. You can restrict to a couple different types. You could do it based on a CSS class. You could do it based on a comment. You could do it based on an element. So I could have just, you know, an element that just said choice percentage instead of an input or a div. The scope definition right there, the equal signs, let it know to copy kind of what's on that scope. So we defined votes and total, and basically what it's doing, we pointed to choice.votes and question.totalVotes. So providing that equal sign right there means on this directive scope, let's set votes equal to that and total equal to that. So those models will sync up. And lastly, we have this link, which basically is the function that is called once it finds everything that it matches those parameters. And basically, here we define an update method, which basically says if the scope total is greater than 0, like it has votes, we're going to calculate the percentage that this one has and set the element's CSS width attribute to match that percentage. And then we have two watches basically saying, hey, if total or votes change, call that method. And then I guess I'll just show the basic demo of this working, hopefully. Here we have that questions list, and simply we click into it, which calls that UI router. Just to note, this pound sign is how you know you're using Angular at that time. It's just kind of their notation of, hey, you're in an Angular single-page app now. Here's where we go through all of our question lists. And again, when we hover over it, it pretty much is going to have the ID of that question and pass it to the state. And then we have all of our options. We're going to vote for the best sci-fi TV show, which I'm sorry is going to be TNG, and it always will be. And there we have our directive of those progress bars that update in real time on the front end while asynchronously calling the back end and updating it in our database. So that every time without a full page refresh at all, we can just continuously update this on the front and back end. That's it. Any questions?
So I hate shebang URLs with the 8,000 sums.
Yes.
Can you get Angulars to work not using those using HTML5 push tags instead?
That's interesting. I haven't done that personally. I don't know. I would imagine there might be a module that you could use to do something like that. Probably not well with Django, given how finicky their URL router is, which is one of the nice things of having the pound sign. With the single page app in Django, it provides that extra layer so you can kind of add whatever you want without messing with Django's router.
Presumably, if you didn't have a problem with all the curly brackets and braces and semicolons,
Yes.
you could use the same strategy with plain old JavaScript if you needed to, right?
100%. 100%. This could all be used with JavaScript instead of CoffeeScript. That's not a problem. As far as the Django interaction, though, with Angular, if you don't do the bracket replacement, you will come into problems if you're trying to use a Django template. It might infer that you're trying to call Django templates and throw errors.
Okay. I wonder if you could tell me a little bit about the Django Rest Framework, like the web interface?
Ah, the web interface. Yeah.
Because that was like one of the things that made me feel about Django Rest Framework.
Yeah. Let's see. What was the endpoint that we used?
I usually use this Chrome extension called Postman, which is
Yes, I've used Postman. We use that with external APIs. We have to deal with like over 60 APIs, so it's really nice to have a quick interface with a lot of them. Polls choices.
Postman is some kind of a testing harness? Or
It's a plugin to Chrome.
It's UI tool to like check to see what your API is returning based on what posts or get. Oh,
It's a Chrome extension.
Yep.
for our application.
cool.
Where do I call this?
But it looks similar to the web interface for the Django Rest Framework. That's what I asked.
Hey, okay. So this is that web browsable API. Pretty much since we just only have that one question, I mean, there's data right there. But pretty much here, you could specify how you want to get the data back if you support multiple ones, if you want the JSON right there, or to go back to that API. You can see all the different options right here. And then at the bottom, if it supports it, let's find a better endpoint. Find out where it is. Django Rest, here we go. URLs. See, it'll also give you the option at the bottom to do posts if you want, to add another one. And if you have that ability, you can. So when you're kind of creating it, you can kind of make it in an iterative fashion. It'll show you all the types of operations you can hit on any endpoint and kind of go back and forth with it. It's really easy to use and probably one of the more notable features.
Can we see the directory structure of templates right there?
Yeah, bring that up. Hope you guys like Vim. Let's see here. So basically how I've laid out this project, and again, it's going to differ based on, that's my talk. One sec. That's reveal. Here we go. It might differ based on the kind of how large your project is, but for smaller projects, I like to do it like this. So here would be my Djangular app. The config is where I would host my settings, my URLs, WSGI, all of that. The polls will be the actual Django app, hosting the models, the admin, all of that. And then I usually like to have what's called like a front-end folder, which would be app.coffee, controllers.copy. I usually like to separate them by their function. Now, as you get into larger apps, this is not going to be scalable, right? Because you're going to have so many different controllers, so many different directives, that it's kind of a pain to have them all housed into one. So what we usually do is we'll separate it by functions. Maybe I'll just bring up Track Maven real quick. Oh boy. Let's see here. Which one is it? So with our production act, we do client, and then you'll have all of our different types of activity feed, like our activity feed, our alerts, our brands, our common. We'll separate it that way, and then within those have all the different types of controllers. So we'll have our rule delete controller. We'll separate them by function and kind of where they belong in the app. And that seems to be a better project structure for how moving forward, how to best group them. And then what we typically do depends on, we usually we'll minify it and convert all of the coffee into one JavaScript file based on that single page app. So for instance, our activity feed, it might be like 12 different CoffeeScript files, which will compile all into one activity.js, because it'll all need to be in that single page app. So the templates, depending again how you can, yes, separate them by, again, like feature. On larger projects, it's definitely best to separate by feature. On smaller single-page apps, what we tend to do is we'll have an index.html with a lot of the templates just defined in there. So, for instance, on this talk, I believe, yeah, so we just had a polls, and in this one index, it's we have, here's the question list template. It's stored within the HTML page. And the ID right there allows the state to know to include that template in the placeholder. And that placeholder just exists simply in that base.html. We defined that, oops, sorry. Where'd it go? Yeah, that UI div that I showed on the slides, it would just replace wherever that view is.
So that index.html that you just had, without the Angular override the square brackets, since you're including this with Django, Django would interpret the curly braces as template language.
Exactly.
Everything less what it had verbatim.
Exactly. Unless you somehow disable the Django templating engine, if it's serving that content, it will blow up if you don't replace it with square brackets.
In your Track Maven 3, there were the templates and the JavaScript
Oh boy. That's a good question. I'd be curious to know that myself. Oops. Client. So this is where we kind of define the module, right? And then that module will kind of be in all the other files in there. So for instance, we just define the Angular module there, and then we don't have to elsewhere. We can just kind of call it angular.module, and it'll already be defined, if that makes sense. So that's like where we like to define it initially.
And that's just emulating the Python?
Essentially, yeah.
It's not a convention of CoffeeScript or
I don't believe so. I think this is our architect likes to keep it as similar as possible from Python to Angular. So this was a convention that was very comfortable for all of us. All right, is that it? All right, thank you. I'm going to put all the source code on GitHub, and feel free to follow and ask me any questions.